Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Seoul Defense Dialogue 2019. As we are to begin the second plenary session under the theme of Peace in Northeast Asia, Challenges and Tasks. Well, this session will be moderated by Professor Ki-Jong of Yonsei University of Republic of Korea. Please give him a big round of applause.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Ki-Jong Kim. I'm teaching at the Yonsei University, which is one of the largest universities in South Korea. This is session 2, plenary session 2. The key issue of our session is the peace in Northeast Asia and the challenges and tasks. As far as we're concerned with the whole dialogue, key concept of our Seoul Defense Dialogue is that peace building together, challenges and visions. Maybe our session is the most important part. So we invited 4 excellent and distinguished scholars, as well as practitioners from the world. Let me introduce Mr. Dean Fealk, who is working as the chair of the Global Strategy and Innovation Halifax International Security Forum. He's sitting to my next, Mr. Dean Fealk. And the President Chen Dongxiao, he is working as a Shanghai Institute for International Studies in China. He's the second man. And Mr. Hideshi Tokuchi, he's working as the visiting professor of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies of Japan. So Mr. Tokuchi is there. And the last person is Mr. Pascal Boniface, who is a founding director of the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs of France. We have a 90 minutes to presentation as well as discussion. In the preliminary meeting, we have arranged some kind of format of our session in this way. I'm going to give the panelists 3 different questions. So we're going to have 3 different rounds. So altogether, our panelists would have 18 minutes together or 20 minutes together. So I'm going to give you 20 minutes total, and then you can separate into 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 10, or 6 minutes, 6 minutes, 8 minutes. It's up to you. But in the first question, the first round of our session that we're going to share and that we're going to discuss is that how do you define the peace, the so-called peace? What do you think is the most important key elements of the peace? So this is the concept of the new topic of the we are going to discuss in the first round of discussion. And the second round topic would be, so what do you see the problem according to your definition of peace? So that is a second round of the second topic of our round. The last one that we're going to discuss is how do you evaluate, how do you understand the importance of the peace process of the Korean Peninsula today? How do you think? What would be the implication of the current situation of the Korean Peninsula? So I'm going to give you a chance to make a presentation first to Mr. Dean Fealk first.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Seoul Defense Dialogue organizers and sponsors for this terrific opportunity. So what is peace? This is seems like sort of an existential moment we're having here. I think fundamentally, peace is freedom. Now I do sound like Descartes. Freedom from conflict and freedom from the sort of fear or threat of conflict. Peace in the context of international affairs, I think, is like peace in the context of human affairs. There's a Maslow's hierarchy. So we want to start with international security. Sometimes that entails the right balance of power, freedoms. In the case of Northeast Asia, we've worked hard for an international rules-based system, that over the course of, recent decades has resulted in, incredible economic dynamism, prosperity, deep democracies flowering and flourishing. But I think ultimately the goal is not just to have peace, it's to move up that Maslow's hierarchy and to have cooperation and harmony, and ultimately to have societies that are interdependent and have sort of exponential virtues. I think the challenge, of course, is there are lots of historical rivalries, in some cases animosities. Nothing happens in a vacuum. And so I would say that, what we want to do, I think for purposes of this forum and this discussion, is think about in practical ways how we can solve the problems at hand. We heard earlier a number of those issues from, the peace process here on the Korean Peninsula, or issues of denuclearization, or the conflict between Korea and Japan. And I think what we want to do is be practical in solving those issues, but also have, I think, a farther vision down the horizon, and think about what have we built over those last, many decades in terms of, yes, we've had a sort of a allies-based system of security. Yes, we've had flourishing liberal democracies. And how do we build on that? What is the trend line? And I would just encourage us, there's an aspect of, I think, being caught in the moment, but I would encourage us to think about those longer-term trend lines and what we can build on in terms of multilateral engagement and the kind of structures and institutions that can support that higher level peace and ultimately cooperation.
Okay. Ms. Chen Dongxiao, what do you think?
Oh, it's not so easy to define the peace, because it is both a status as well as kind of a process. I think peace, I agree with my previous speaker said that it is a kind of a status of no war. So on that end of the spectrum, no war is the prerequisite, it's the precondition of what we can define as peace. But as for the another end of peace of this spectrum, the no threat of conflicts or even a state of harmony, I think that maybe that is will be more difficult if we can define that status as a peace, because in that way there almost no peace at all in this world. If you can say that there's a zero threat of conflicts or disputes or harmony, there's no harmony or paradise in this world. Having said that, what are the most important key elements, as you said, which are conducive to this peace status? I think that it could be framed from the different levels. At least from the state level, I think that the government or those decision makers of those government should have a peace-loving or pro-peace strategy of itself. If this government pursue a non-peaceful strategy, or provocative, aggressive strategy, it is unlikely to say that this country is pro-peace or not. At the same time, I think in the international level, I think, yes, the balance of power is very important. But the balance of power is not sufficient enough to prevent the war from happening. More importantly, given the increasingly interdependence, hyper-connected of the world today, I think that in addition to the so-called balance of power perspective, we should cultivate a sense of a no-war prospect for all the members. That will make those security policy for each state quite different from the previous one. In addition to, instead of pursuing the security policy against each other, we should pursue the security with each other. And we also need to cultivate the sense of a cooperative security. And also, don't forget that the development itself, I mean economic development itself, will lay down the solid foundation for a sustainable stability and peace, both with regard to this country individually, for the region, and for the world as a whole. So in that regard, I think that the peace at the minimum status, no war, particularly among the big powers with nuclear power, it is more likely than before. But for those a more long-term a peace with no threat of conflicts, it is still very difficult and a long way to go.
Okay, Mr. Chen, I assume that you have a lot of things to discuss or to speak out when you have round two, that you, according to your own definition of peace and what is the problem of Northeast Asian international politics today. So let us expect second round. Professor Tokuchi, what is your own definition? What is key elements of your definition of peace?
First of all, let me thank the organizer of this very important dialogue. I would like to thank all the people who made my trip to and my pleasant stay in Seoul possible. Thank you very much. Actually, it's a very difficult question to answer. How should we define peace? If we knew the right answer, the world would be more peaceful, I think. But in my personal view, the most important thing about peace is the maintenance of the liberal, rules-based liberal international order. Because most of the countries, particularly of this prosperous region, of course including South Korea, Japan, and even China, have many, many benefits from this order. So, what is important for the maintenance of the rules-based liberal international order? Well, today's world has several phases. It's a system of power. It's a system of values, and it's a system of norms. And of course, the balance of power is the most important thing. And establishing the balance of power in this region is very, very difficult. This region is heavily armed. China has nuclear weapons, Russia has nuclear weapons, and now, illegitimately, North Korea has nuclear weapons. There are 3 nuclear weapon states in this region. And we need the United States for our security, but the United States is far away geographically. So we are in a very, very difficult position right now. And in addition, today's world has 2 phases. One is the international society of sovereign states, and the other is global society without any national borders. So the rules to govern these 2 communities are not exactly the same. Of course, there are many commonalities, but we have to think differently when we think about the security and peace of these 2 international, or global societies. And this region, the countries of this region are competing with each other mainly over physical space, not necessarily over ideas or principles, but the competition or confrontation between the United States and China affect the situations, particularly security environment of this region. And the United States has been the champion of the rules-based liberal international order for many years. And China now is progressing under the banner of a community with a shared future for mankind. I'm not sure what it really means, but it's the relationship between the United States and China and its impact on the security environment of this region has become similar to the confrontation in the Cold War days. Of course, there are many differences between the original Cold War and the new Cold War, but there are some commonalities, I think. So when we think about peace, particularly in this region, we have to think about these kind of elements.
Okay, thank you, Professor Tokuchi. The last panelist, Dr. Boniface.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank the organizer and to congratulate them because it's very well organized and it's a wonderful meeting. Peace, in fact, it's perhaps easier to define than to achieve. To define peace, it's the absence of war, but there is different kind of war. You have economic war, you have intelligence war, you have cyber war, and you have the war. So war, it's when you use weapons to solve your differences. And so peace is not to use weapons when you have differences of perception and differences of interest. So peace is not, it's different from democracy. Sometimes we heard that democratic countries never went to war. It's untrue. You have a lot of democracy which came to war and some dictatorship who were peaceful. But of course, democracy is better than dictatorship. But there is no direct link between peace and democracy. Peace is different, war is different from crisis. You could have crisis, but without solving it by weapons. For example, in Europe, we have still differences of interest between France, Germany, and UK, which is still in EU now. But contrary to the past time, there is no more war between members of EU. So it's a biggest achievement to avoid to use weapons when we have divergences and differences. And so peace is to agree, to negotiate, to agree to have differences without using weapons, and so to resort to multilateralism, to resort to negotiation, to end the difficulties, and so you need trust. Without trust, it's very difficult to reach peace, because you could have war by miscalculation, by false perception, by absence of confidence-building measures. I will say that referring to the present situation between China and USA, there is a kind of economic war which has started with new taxes, but it's not real war. There is no guns, there is no weapons. It could transform into a normal war. Of course, we will hope that this economic war will be solved, but we could not confuse economic differences, economic war with the real war. The real wars when you kill people, when you use weapons, when you destroy cities, when you bomb civil population, when you bomb the other. So it's very different from any other form of crisis. So war and crisis are very different, and you could have peace even in crisis time. So the main task is to avoid a crisis to turn into war. And how to avoid a crisis to turn into war? By negotiation, by multilateralism, by trust.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Boniface. Now it's time to move to round two. The topic, as I mentioned, that maybe this is linked to the the topic of the round one. So, according to your own definition of peace, what are we facing with the major problems in this region? How do you evaluate? What are the challenges, the so-called challenges that we are facing with? Now, I'm going to give you the chance to Dr. Chen first.
Thank you. I think that this region, Northeast Asia and East Asia as a whole, has been encountering a plethora of challenges regarding how to maintaining the peace and stability. This morning we heard a lot about talking about Korean Peninsula. But I don't want to elaborate in details because we have already talked about it quite a bit. I think that the general security dynamics of this region has been on the cusp of profound change. Quite a number of factors, forces working together to try to shape the trajectory of the security situation of this region. But it's still unclear where is the evolving direction. Because many of those factors, forces, are themselves in the process of evolving, unraveling. I think that at least a couple of factors which should be highlighted here. At the global level, the international order itself is moving into a new era. The geoeconomic and the geopolitical center of gravity is moving from the west to the east, particularly in Asia. Which means that what we have quite knowledgeable and familiar with the traditional transatlantic-centric international order is declining, is down. With the rise of a plethora of increasing number of non-West power. Most of them are in Asia, Asia Pacific. One of the implications of those shift of international order is that with coming of these newcomers, they have shifted their conventional role of roles taking towards roles making, even if it is still at its quite early stage, from the roles taking to the roles making. And for those transatlantic powers, including the United States, they also somewhat shift their role from a roles keeping towards roles dismantling. So this is a quite big challenge. The old international order is gradually gone, but the new one has not yet emerged fully. This is the first I want to emphasize. And the second one, which is very related to this international order shifting, as some of colleagues mentioned, that the big power relationship, including the US-China relationship, is at its crossroads. This relationship, which should be working as the most important one for cooperation, now has been defined increasingly by the distrust and even open hostility. So I think the operating system driving this bilateral relationship, something's wrong with this operating system. In Washington, quite a number of people believe that China is the leading revisionist power, challenging the US-led order. And they believe that those engagement policy has been a kind of a miserable failure. So Washington should change its course immediately, if not to be too late. Some people, some extreme view, but not so uncommon, even calls for a de-link, disengage, decoupling, whatever you call it. In Beijing, even if I myself have not observed a new edition of official strategy towards the United States, but I think that there's a prevailing view in China that China should get itself more prepared for a more hostile US in China's peaceful rise. So I don't know where this strategic competition will lead us to. Whether it will be a new Cold War, as some of our Japanese colleagues mentioned, how to rebalance the cooperation and the competition. I still believe that the US and China, they still share quite a number of common interests, including denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. How to evaluate the cost of this new Cold War, or decoupling. I don't believe that there's a consensus, a solid consensus in Washington regarding these kind of questions. And even how to form a coalition of united front against China, either in Asia Pacific or even in Europe. So I think that there's no consensus. But the danger is that there's a driving force we have observed in Washington to try to keep the direction in that way. So finally, to what kind of impact to this region as a whole, I think that the rest of the countries, Japan, South Korea, or Korea, Mongolia, or some other Northeast Asian countries, their relationship between among themselves have encountered to a more complicated geometry, all right? It's, they don't want to be forced to take side. But same time, yes, they don't want to be forced to take side. They even want to try to, maintain the strategic autonomy, as our Korean colleagues have mentioned quite often. But how to do with that when those two big elephants is going to compete each other? All those glass, they feel very much about they are quite concerned about their security and interests being undermined. So I think that we should work together to prevent such kind of direction from continue moving towards an uncontrollable real crisis or even escalation.
So you're done. So, Dr. Chen, I think that you're pointing out that bilateral relations and tensions of the bilateral relations between China and the United States would be the most important challenge to this region. And then you
one off actually.
Okay. Then tension, as far as a tension, just speaking of the tension, is concerned that maybe Washington is more responsible for that, for that tension. Mr. Fealk,
Yes.
how do you think?
Well, I certainly can confirm some of the sentiments. There's been an absolute sea change, I think, in the United States in terms of, viewing China primarily as a competitor. And that has, as the expression goes, it happened very gradually and then all of a sudden. And by the way, that crosses party line, it crosses geography from Washington to Silicon Valley. So there has been a change, I think, in thinking. I do agree that we are in an Asian century. There's no doubt about it. But the United States is an Asian economy and it's an Asian power. And I think when we think about if there is a new world order, when we think about what it might look like, part of what we think about is, our values and, what is it if we think it's a manifestation of, Enlightenment values, if we think that, in the post-war era, we think about, I see many countries in this room have built just, tremendous democracies. And so I think, although I certainly would agree that we need to incorporate a broader set of stakeholders and indeed recalibrate probably the influence that those stakeholders have. There's certainly no doubt about it. My concern is that, as you described, I think the idea is that we now have what's been described as the Thucydides trap, with whether the United States, how can it deal with a rising China, and what are the prospects for conflict when you have a relatively declining power in the face of that rising power. And the great work by Graham Allison on that, or Allison Graham on that. And it's not an easy question. It is in some ways the question of our time, or at least this moment. It's directly related to this discussion on peace in Northeast Asia, because issues now that have a in concentric circles that have a Korea component or a regional component now play into a broader lens of sort of global geopolitics and big power rivalry. So what happens in Northeast Asia no longer stays in Northeast Asia. So I agree with you that at core the question was, what's the problem? How come we don't have peace? And the answer is that we look at each other and see more differences than similarities in some cases. In some cases we don't have the courage to make political change, and so we have our work cut out for us.
Your argument sounds like very much practical approach to peace as well as how to solve the problem in this region. Yeah, Professor Tokuchi, you already mentioned the importance of liberal international order in which we can enjoy the meaning of peace. Then what do you see the major challenges and major problem of our region, East Asia, or we can say the Northeast Asia today?
Well, Professor Kim, thank you very much for that very important question. But before answering that important question, I would like to say something about the concept of a new Cold War, because I used that concept. But in order to avoid any misunderstanding, I would like to emphasize 2 points first. The competition between China and the United States today is a matter of choice between the liberal democratic system and digital authoritarianism, or the liberal democratic system and authoritarian capitalism. So in that sense, it's a matter of the competition between the two political systems. So there are some countries who are forced to make a choice between the two. But that is not the same as the power struggle and power competition between the United States and the former Soviet Union. China is already integrated in the world economy and in the world, actually. So the containment of China is not a policy to take. So there shouldn't be any misunderstanding about that point. And secondly, China is stronger than the former Soviet Union. Although the former Soviet Union and present Russia has many nuclear weapons which can destroy the whole world, and China doesn't. But nonetheless, China has military power, economic power, political power, and cultural power. And in comparison, the former Soviet Union did not have such kind of a comprehensive power. So the relationship between the United States and China today is much different from the old relationship between the United States and the former Soviet Union. Well, answering to Professor Kim's question, I would like to say a few words. As I have already said, many countries in this region have got great benefits from the maintenance of the rules-based liberal international order. Although this order is shaking right now, we have to be reminded that the basic principles buttressing the rules-based liberal international order probably, just probably though, probably correspond to the fundamental nature of mankind. So if fully observed, those principles will benefit all, I believe. Therefore, all the nation states, particularly those advanced liberal democracies, must have immense interest in preserving and strengthening this international order. However, the rules-based liberal international order is a very fragile order. for a number of reasons. First of all, this order has not covered the entire world, although this order has expanded since the end of the Cold War. Still, it has not become truly universal. This is my first point. Secondly, the rules-based liberal international order is premised on the system of sovereign nation states. As I said, this globe is shifting from the international society to the global society. And accordingly, there have emerged a variety of actors who can't be fully controlled by nation states or traditional rules of the international society. And thirdly, the system of sovereign nation states works in accordance with the modern system of international law. In my understanding, China is not satisfied with the modern system of international law. The Chinese are willing to exploit the benefit of their external effect of international law, but they do not fully agree on the current system of international law. And in my understanding, it is because of their experience of a long-time humiliation in the mid-19th century and early 20th century, when the modern European international system expanded to reach out to this region, and China was integrated in that system. China was forced to join the system through unequal treaties and put in a very inferior position. So one Japanese international lawyer said once that China was forced to stay in the unequal position in the international system of equal nations. And next, liberal order helps produce diverse values and way of life, both nationally and internationally. It accelerates the challenges of policies, for example, migration or same-sex marriage, something like that. So it will affect the stability of societies where traditional values are dominant and brings uncertainty and anxiety in the minds of the public who are not accustomed to such an enormous shift. And finally, the idea of the rules-based liberal international order reflects American political system. In the Cold War age, one renowned Japanese political scientist said that people in this world are naturally likely to choose the American way of life when they have the right to choose. I assume many people in this world tend to agree with him, but I also think that there are so many people who are not for his view. Today, the image, I'm very sorry to say this in front of very intelligent Americans, but the image of the United States is not necessarily bright. The US is discussed with a lot of negative words than positive words, decline or arrogance and a lot more. So there are so many people on this planet who have strong resentment toward the United States. Actually, I have no resentment against the United States, so please do not misunderstand me. So they are not willing to accept the values of the so-called rules-based liberal international order. Having said so, we should not overlook the resilience and the recovering power of the United States. So I assume that those people who believe the decline, absolute decline of the United States would regret in future. But anyway, I would like to point out that the rules-based liberal international order is a fragile one.
So what you actually say is that the liberal international order, the core of which is that way of life, freedom in way of life and the democracy and American political systems, that kind of things. That is what you're saying, right? Maybe Chen, I guess you have much more to say something to Mr. Tokuchi, but just wait a little bit. Mr. Boniface, what do you see our problem? Our means that East Asian problem, the view from the European experience.
Yeah. First of all, there is no war in this era. There is a high level of crisis, but fortunately there is no war. So you could see the glass half empty and not half full. In my mind, there is 4 main obstacles to peace or to absence of crisis in this region. The first is historical roots. The past has not passed. It's a main difference with Europe. In Europe, we were hardline enemy with Germany. Now we are close friends. And we are able, between German and French scholars, to write together a history book. I don't think it would be possible between Japan and Korea or between China and Japan. So the difference of perception of history, the fact that the historical opposition is still active, is one of the main obstacles of peace or absence of crisis. The second one is the absence of balance of forces. The actors are too different and with different forces. There is no balance of forces possible in an era in which you have US, Japan, Korea, North Korea, Russia, and with no strong alliance, there is no 2 camps like in Europe during the Cold War. And so the alliances are very elusive and the actors are too numerous and too different to allow a balance of forces. The third is a difference of perception of securities. None of the countries have a common perception of security. And it's very difficult to find a common approach between the 2 Korea, between Japan and South Korea, between China and other state actors. And the fourth one is the absence of a multilateral body or multilateral organization specific to this strategic era. There is not a body in which you could together discuss of security, discuss of the perception of security, discuss, for example, establish confidence building measure. So there is too divisive and there is too many differences between the actors. But nevertheless, as I told at the beginning of my speech, there is still no war, and it's quite a miracle that there is no war, and we are regarding a rise of tension since 1 year in this era, but still war is not imaginable because it will be too costly, it will be the beginning of a third world war, and it will be not rational. So, of course, the rationality is not always in common, but the price will be too high. And I think that all the actors, in their differences, all the actors and all the head of states are rational. I don't think that Kim Jong-un is irrational. I don't think that Trump is irrational. All of them are rational. They have different nationality, they have different interests, but I think that for this reason, war is not a short-term possibility. But the maintenance of a high-level crisis is still a difficulty and a costly difficulty because, for example, the tension between US and China has effect even in Europe, and even in Africa, even in Latin America. And if we could reach an agreement between these 2 giants, it will be good not only for them, but also for everybody in the world.
So this is very impressive that you pointed out that compared to what happened in Europe after the end of World War II, you have tried and succeeded in making multilateral cooperation work in Europe. But when we look at the Northeast Asia today, we are facing with many problems. Even though we are trying to find a new way, a new paradigm on the Korean Peninsula, but in the Northeast Asia, it is not only a matter of a rivalry between China and Japan, or even global structure of China and the U.S. I mean, looking back to history of Northeast Asia, as you mentioned, that we are suffering from some kind of a lack of institutional setting. We don't have, as you said, we don't have any kind of a multilateral security, cooperation in terms of, institutional form. Instead, we've, bilateral alliance has been working. So maybe that was the future task that we should achieve. In addition to that, I'm going to give you a last chance about our last topic. But before that, in addition to that problem of a lack of institutional setting in Northeast Asia, we have sustained insecurity. We are still suffering. Excuse me. We are still witnessing, the continuity of a military build-up in this region, and nationalism problem, the very provocative nature of nationalism. But in Northeast Asia, also we have some kind of. This is very, as far as South Korean people's perception is concerned, historical memory or insufficient reconciliation in this region is a major problem that we are facing with. History is not history. History still is living as a very important issue in the current diplomacy of South Korea, Japan, and China. So, these are the pictures that we described in Northeast Asia today. So, having that in mind, the last topic that we're going to discuss is that in this region, in this Northeast Asia today, we cannot find manageable way of peace. But in last year, the year of 2018, some kind of wonderful things happen in this peninsula. Some people say this is a huge or dramatic change, or some people describe it in this way. We are entering into the paradigm change on the Korean Peninsula. Maybe some of you would not fully agree with that, but in bottom line is that something is happening now, even though it is very slow. So we call it this is a peace process has begun on the Korean Peninsula. How do you evaluate? How do you see? What is the implication of something happening on the Korean Peninsula, the so-called peace process, to the future of this region, Northeast Asia? Boniface first, and then Tokuchi sensei, and then Chen, and Mr. Fealk.
I kept in memory the wonderful image of the two Korean delegations at the Olympic Games. And together, it was unimaginable just a few months before. And the fact that during the Olympics, the North and the South could form a joint delegation and a joint team in hockey. It was wonderful, and it was a very important step It's symbolic, but the symbols are important in diplomacy and international relations. I think that, so you have achieved a lot of things, because in 2017 it was the warmonger were at the forefront, and we heard about the would be possible even nuclear war. And just a year after it was peace, the joint delegation and the Olympic peace. But now you have some more difficulties. I will say that perhaps because your goal must not be too important. If we want to maintain a good situation in the area, I think it would be excessively optimistic to ask North Korea to denuclearize and even more to turn into a democracy. So I think it's ironic and even perhaps foolish to try to ask for North Korea to transform itself into another regime. Maybe it should happen in few years, in some years, but not regularly. And if you look once again the situation in Europe, it's because they accept to discuss together whatever their differences, then the two Germany are now reunified. And if without the brand policy, without the Ostpolitik, I'm sure there is no reunification and no end of Cold War in Europe. Second, denuclearization. Of course, I fully understand it's a main goal, but it must not be a short-term goals, because for Kim Jong-un, nuclear weapons are life insurance. And because we are a little at stake with France, he probably thinks that had Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi kept or had nuclear weapons, they were still in life and in power. So I think it's too soon to ask to Kim Jong-un to denuclearize and to achieve peace. We will have economic relations, like between the two Germany, like between the two Koreans, and after we could ask to Kim Jong-un to denuclearize. But to ask a short-term denuclearization as a prerequisite to a peace agreement, to the resuming economic relationship, it's just a way to prevent any progress. And so I think the only realistic way is to take the North Korea as it is. And to quote Egon Bahr, who was the mastermind of Ostpolitik, the German one, Egon Bahr has stated, if you want to change a status quo, you need first to recognize it. So let's be realistic. North Korea is North Korea. It's a very problematic country, but you won't change it with a snap of finger and with a short-term negotiation. So we need time, we need to be patient, and to have a result on long terms. Between Ostpolitik and German reunification, it has passed 22 years, but the goal is there. And I think that perhaps, of course, comparison is not reason. Every country is different, but there is something to learn from the German example.
Okay, the same question was given to Professor Tokuchi. What do you evaluate of current changes on the Korean Peninsula to you or the Japanese scholars or the ordinary Japanese people in general?
Well, I have 3 points. First is the importance of taking balance between cooperation and competition. I'm mainly thinking about Chinese BRI and the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, which the United States, Japan, Australia, and India are promoting. I'm saying this because the free and open Indo-Pacific is not only about the infrastructure investment and maritime security. It's also about the non-proliferation. If you carefully read the text of the speeches by Japanese Prime Minister Abe, he clearly mentions the non-proliferation aspect of the vision for the free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think this is a very important point. And, both BRI and free and open Indo-Pacific have strategic aspect and economic and trade and investment aspect. In terms of the strategic aspect, I can't deny the competitive and confrontational aspect of these two concepts. But there is no denying that there is an immense demand for infrastructure investment in this region. Therefore, investment and trade, these two concepts are not mutually exclusive. So the balance and synergy of cooperation and competition, this is very important. And secondly, synergy of engagement and pressure, this is important too. In my personal view, today's world is tilted toward engagement with North Korea for the sake of engagement. However, there are three schools of thoughts about North Korea's intention to denuclearize in Japan, in the Japanese intellectuals. There are three. First, North Korea has made a strategic decision to denuclearize because nuclear weapons cannot feed North Koreans. However, there is another opinion. They say that North Korea has made a strategic decision not to denuclearize because nuclear weaponry is an indispensable tool for deterrence. And third group, they say that North Korea is willing to denuclearize. However, they are wondering. So they are waiting and watching for the US response. And I am very much skeptical about the North Korean intention. Just look back at what North Koreans said in April 2017 when the United States bombed Syria. The North Koreans said, the US picks non-nuclear states and bombs. So the Trump's administration is the same. It tells quite something. And in April last year, North Korea said that North Korea has decided to concentrate on economic development. But in that decision, North Korea did not say anything about their willingness to denuclearize. And so the balance and synergy of engagement and pressure is still important. And thirdly, synergy of bilateralism and multilateralism when we think about the Korean Peninsula, Northeast Asia, and Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. The most important thing in establishing the order in this region is balance of power. So the US-centered alliance network is the most important tool for the establishment of the balance of power. However, it is not the only tool for regional order. For example, ASEAN-based multilateralism is in progress right now. So there are so many networks in this region. US-centered alliance network, ASEAN-centered multilateralism, or Japan, China, Korea trilateralism, so many networks. So instead of thinking about a new security architecture, completely new security architecture in this region, we should think about networking of these present networks. I think that is more productive and realistic. And so, and it will help the permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula as well.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kikuchi. Dr. Chen Dongxiao, what do you think? The China is sharing a borderline with North Korea. North Korea is your ally, sometimes headache to you. But what do you see the current situation on the Korean Peninsula in terms of a peace process? And how do we expect the future of the Korean Peninsula, view from the Chinese people?
Well, compared with relatively unpredictable or even much more complicated regional security dynamics as a whole of the region, I think that in the past 2 years, or 1 year and a half actually, we have got the biggest, most promising, encouraging news from Korean Peninsula actually. Fundamentally speaking, the confrontational mode of those countries' interaction with each other between the Pyongyang and Seoul, and between the Pyongyang and Washington, have shifted towards negotiation mode. I think that's one of the most welcoming and promising, encouraging news. And I think that China and Beijing should support this process. And I think that we support the strategic reorientation of Pyongyang's strategy of focusing more on economic development. And we also support very strongly of the reconciliation of the intra-Korean peace dialogue, reconciliation. And we also support the direct contact between Washington and so I think that Beijing, it should be in the interest of Beijing to continue to support. And so there's no reason for Beijing to change the course in that way, despite of a more complicated bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing in that regard. Of course, Beijing and Washington have different views about how to specifically approach that objective, but at least we share those common interest and objective of this region. I think that we should continue to work closely on that purpose. Having said that, I would like to respond very briefly to our Japanese colleagues about the mention of his Indo-Pacific idea. I think that, as I understand, we are open. Chinese people, actually, Beijing, including the government of Beijing, are quite open to any kind of a proposal, as long as it is in the interest of the common security of all. I think that that this is one of the reasons that I think China shares a lot of the ideas and principles of ASEAN's latest issues, the outlook of the Indo-Pacific, the inclusiveness, inclusiveness and win-win cooperation, connectivities. I think that all these are very good ideas about that. But of course, we oppose those ideas who are going to advocate exclusiveness. We oppose those ideas which will, folks totally try to highlight the difference between the so-called sea power, continental power. I think that it's make things much more confrontational.
So you're concerned with the traditional dichotomy of sea power, maritime power versus continental power. That is not
it's unnecessary to highlight the dichotomy.
Yeah. So you don't agree with that,
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I'm going to tell you about something about that. What would be South Korea's role, with regard to that dichotomy? Mr. Fealk, what do you think about the future of Korea?
Well, it was said, I think, in the earlier panel, but we may be closer to having a deal of some sort than in recent memory. If you could have predicted that, perhaps you would have predicted Brexit in the election of Donald Trump. But I guess if you want to be an overnight success, it takes 20 years of hard work. And I think, President Moon in particular has done a terrific job in terms of his diplomacy. I think Korea is showing a lot of maturity in terms of encouraging multilateral cooperation. Was mentioned the Northeast Asia Plus Community of Responsibility. So we have an opportunity, and I think, yes, it's true the devil will be in the details. Is the type of denuclearization that we're looking for on the table? What would a peace deal look like? What would reunification look like? What would those, economic development challenges, how would we face those? Quite daunting. And of course, what comes next? What does it mean for the U.S. ROK alliance? What does it mean for U.S. Forces Korea? I mean, these are, complex questions. They're important questions. But at the end of the day, I think the opportunity is too great. I think, not to explore with our best efforts and with open hearts.
Okay. Thank you for wonderful, panelists. We have a very limited time to discuss 3 different topics, in 80 minutes. But we have roughly 15 minutes left. So I'm going to open the discussion to the floor. Can I invite some questions or comment from the floor?
Well, I guess the panel discussion was perfect, that there was
Oh,
no
okay.
there was no question at the floor.
Well, all of a sudden, very silent. Well, traditional dichotomy, this is a geopolitical concept. Some people is using very frequently in not only today, but in all the times. That is maritime power versus continental power. Interestingly, but in a very sadly, Korean Peninsula is entrapped by that, the 2 powers. We are trying to apply, or we're trying to think of new concept, of new paradigms by which we can describe the international politics. That is community. That community is the lesson we learn from the European experience. It is very philosophical term. It is very abstractive term, actually. But even within Japan or even China, but in many scholars in South Korea, we have discussed the concept of a community building in Northeast Asia. Maybe, security community or even, economic community. The thing is that, what I'm trying to say is that when we use the academic terms or a definition of by which we explain the international phenomena, international politics, or even our policy, or even a strategy. Continental power and maritime power is, it is a very much, exclusive dichotomy. Or we can see that, this dichotomy sounds like it has some kind of elements or possible elements of confrontation, or rivalry. So instead, we are trying to use the other terms like community building. So that is, as far as I know, that the South Koreans, current South Korean, Moon Jae-in government, Moon Jae-in administration is trying to suggest a new idea to the people and to the neighboring countries, because this is partly it is inherited from the Koreans' memory about our history, because Korea is located in the peninsula. Peninsula is located in between maritime and continental. So sometimes we are very much easily sacrificed by that concept, maritime power versus continental power. So so maybe that has maybe we have a different way of understand that kind of dichotomy. Tokuchi-san, do you have something to add?
I have one comment about the question of continental powers and maritime powers. In my view, continental powers have continental mindset, and maritime powers have maritime mindset. I mean that if you look at the interpretation of the law of the sea by continental powers, it is not necessarily the same as the interpretation by maritime powers. In the 1950s and 60s, the interpretation or positions on the maritime law between the former Soviet Union and the United States was much different from each other. But when the former Soviet Union expanded to the oceans and it became a maritime power, the United States and the former Soviet Union were successful in reaching an agreement on the law of the sea. That's why UNCLOS was established in the 1980s. I'm not sure whether a similar thing can be said in terms of the relationship between the current United States and current China. But there are a few people who will predict that if China continues to make maritime expansion, there will be a change in the interpretation of the Chinese about the UN law of the sea. Well, I wish it will be true. I'm saying that in my understanding, China has a concept of maritime territory, meaning to include continental shelf and exclusive economic zone. And by the maritime territory, the concept of maritime territory sounds like extension of land territory to the ocean. Probably I'm a little bit exaggerating the Chinese expression, but there is when we think about the legal order in the maritime space, we shouldn't overlook the difference between land powers and maritime powers.
Okay, thank you, Professor Tokuchi. And Mr. Boniface, you have something more?
Yes, I don't think that geography makes geopolitics, and the boundary does not make automatically a kind of relationship. For example, England is maritime power, and Germany is a continental power. They launched together the First World War, and now they are close allies. And their geographic differences are still the same. And if you took the history between France and Germany, the boundary has changed a little bit after World War I. But we are still neighbors, but we were enemies, and we are close friends now. And still, we are at the same contacts between us. So I think it could be a trap to think that geography has automatic consequences. the political willingness is much more important.
That's a good point. You know, geography is object. Geopolitical concept is understanding, very subjective. You know, Chen Sensei.
Well, I think that we are living in the 21st century. So those very conventional concepts of those maritime power vis-a-vis those continental power I think that it's out of date. We are living, I like your idea of the community, that we are such a closely interdependent, economically, and also through those internet. Our interests are also much more mutually vulnerable if we have not such kind of a community identity. So in that regard, what I want to point out is that if we deliberately try to emphasize, amplify, or highlight those so-called dichotomy of those sea power versus continental power, that makes no sense. And actually, which country in the world is really a so-called sea power or continental power? Kazakhstan, landlocked, maybe. But even Kazakhstan, I think that nowadays, they also hope that through those lots of connectivity, try to a more sea connectivity. My point is that as long as we pursue the policy of those common interests based upon the common security, that will make the topic of today, the peace-making, peace-building, more likely. If we try to continue to pursue our policy based upon exclusiveness, either ideology-based or only narrowly defined and national interest-based, it is impossible for us to work together for peace. So this is what I want to emphasize the last. So the last land of the Cold War in this area, last land of Cold War of Korean Peninsula. Whether as this a video at the very beginning of, I like this video very much, that now we will see the prospect of transform those last land of peace or last land of Cold War into the dream land of peace and stability. That is a test for all of us to try to make our mind change our mindset.
Well, as a South Korean scholar, I'm studying and I'm teaching international politics and theory as well as history. But I guess that the South Korean people, not only scholars, but in ordinary people too, that we are very much sensitive to the international environment. Because of we have a tragic memory of we lost our sovereignty of 1910, and we are divided, and we had a war. And even after the war, we had experienced the long time of confrontation, ideological confrontation, not only inside of South Korea, but in inter-Korean relations too. So we are very sensitive of what words, what concept to choose and use. Term is important. Paradigm or assumption is very, very much, important to us. We believe that, this is my concluding, the conclusion of my session. In our session, we're supposed to discuss, Northeast Asia, the peace in Northeast Asia, and what kind of challenges do we have, and what should be, solved for the future. I think that one of the main questions is that how do you see the current changes of situation on the Korean Peninsula? let me say this this new term. I mean, this new term, new concept, I think implies that what South Korea should or want to deal with the so-called geopolitical concept. That's that. About a month ago, when our president Moon Jae-in made an address when we celebrated Liberation Day, August 15th, he suggested one of our strategy for the future is the bridging state. We are going to become or work as a bridging state. Or, in other words, we want to become a bridging state. Bridging state, that is not, we do not want to be entrapped and to be sacrificed by the confrontation between the so-called continental and the maritime power. Instead, we like to play a certain role of connections with open strategy. So that is the main key concept of the bridging state. That simple word, I guess, it implies that how do we, what kind of historical memory about our own, history of sacrifice. We do not want to repeat that, that tragedy. So the big paradigm change since the, Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games. Some people say it was the new spring has come to the Korean Peninsula. Still, it is we are on the rocky road. Pace became all of a sudden slow, but we do not want to lose our faith and hope to the future. Because we believe that without peace on the Korean Peninsula, there will be no way to achieve the peace on the Northeast Asia. It is strongly connected. If you want a peace on the Korean Peninsula, if you want to peaceful order in this region, you have a certain political responsibility to establish on the Korean Peninsula first. So that is our, demand and our hope. So South Korean people and the South Korean government is trying to work very hard, to solve the problem of, denuclearization of North Korea. Bilateral talk between U.S., Washington and Pyongyang is important, but that is not the only way to achieve. So, in our way, we describe in this way. We have two different ways to achieve the peace. I mean, the combination between peace and the denuclearization. One is peace through denuclearization. That is a focus on the bilateral talk between Washington and Pyongyang. But in South Korean government is also has very much interest, and we have to pay strong attention to that denuclearization through peace in inter-Korean policy, inter-Korean relations. So we have to do in both ways. So in making peace on the Korean Peninsula, in the South Korean view, is very much desperate, and peace is imperative. Because that future situation, what we believe that would determine our destiny. So we are going to wrap up our session, and thank you very much for the wonderful 4 panelists to discuss many kinds of topics, peace and Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for doing a wonderful job as a moderator, as well as the 4 panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our second plenary session. So please enjoy the refreshments that we have prepared outside. And we will be starting the special sessions at 3:30 at the 3rd floor, the Sapphire Ballroom. We will be starting the special sessions at 3:30 at the 3rd floor Sapphire Ballroom. So please keep your support with our special sessions as well. Thank you very much.